Welcome to today's webinar, the Early Intervention Innovation Fund webinar. My name is Tanya Morinda. I'm with the Centre for Alcohol and Other Drugs at the New South Wales Ministry of Health. Today we have a stellar lineup for today's presentation on exploring the efficacy of specialist long-term community-based AOD outreach support for people leaving prison. So I think today will be a fantastic presentation. I'll now hand you over to Dr. Mindy Sotiri, Dr. Ruth McCausland, and Dr. Rebecca Reeve.
Thanks so much, Tanya, and thanks so much for joining. I just want to start today. My name's Mindy Sotiri, and I want to begin by acknowledging that we're meeting on Aboriginal land. I'm on the lands of the Gadigal people, and acknowledge the lands of the country wherever you're living and working. I want to also pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge any Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people that are joining us in the meeting today. I guess that when I also want to acknowledge the sort of Aboriginal men, women and kids that are locked up in New South Wales prisons, and in fact in prisons around Australia today. I think when we're talking about the relationship between AOD use, imprisonment, over-incarceration, and the sort of structural drivers of why people go to prison, it's super important to acknowledge the history of colonisation and dispossession and the relationship that that has with imprisonment. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to share this piece of work along with my colleagues, Dr. Ruth McCausland and Dr. Rebecca Reeve from the University of New South Wales. I'm going to introduce the project and talk a little bit about one aspect of it. But before I do that, I just want to let you know, run you through who CRC is, the Community Restorative Centre, and why we decided to do this, this piece of research. So Beck, if you just want to go into the context slide, that'd be great. So CRC is a mid-sized NGO. We provide a range of specialist services to people that are involved in the justice system and their families. We're based in New South Wales only, and all CRC programs really try to break entrenched cycles of disadvantage and imprisonment. And we try and do this very holistically by addressing the drivers of incarceration. So things like homelessness, social isolation, employment, family relationships, histories of trauma, and including, very importantly, and as emerged in this research is a very important theme, the trauma of imprisonment itself. So the New South Wales prison population at the moment is around 12,700, and the flow-through population, which is the numbers of people coming out of prison, which is actually probably a bit more important to think about in the context of this research, is around 20,000 people each year. So we know that around 50% of that 20,000 people will return to prison within 2 years, and we know also that recidivism rates, so the numbers of people going back, gets a lot higher for people that have experienced prior imprisonment, and is almost twice as high for some populations, including those with multiple and complex disadvantage, including alcohol and other drug issues, cognitive disability, homelessness, mental health. So of those 20,000 people coming out of prison each year, CRC works with around 800 people on release each year, using models that are very comparable to those that are studied in this evaluation. And I guess, like a lot of community sector organisations, we receive funding from multiple government and non-government sources, and have, like a lot of people on this call, would have a great deal of funding instability, often as a consequence of the very short-term funding environment in which so much community sector funding operates in. We've been around for 70 years. We've got sort of this incredible expertise and specialism in providing support to people leaving prison. But because of these funding shortfalls, we've seen over many decades some really great, successful programs stop operating, not because they weren't working, but rather as a consequence of the short-term nature of funding cycles. And I guess in part this research, and in part what CRC has tried to do, is respond to the uncertainty in the funding landscape by really trying to ensure that priority is given to developing a really strong evidence base that drives program design and delivery. And I guess that what I want to make clear is that researching the outcomes for CRC clients in this way, in the way that we're presenting today, although it's critical in terms of telling the stories of the people that CRC works with, but also in a broader way, it's really critical in terms of trying to understand across the sector the value of programs that have been built from the specialist knowledge and expertise that's been honed over, often decades of reflective service delivery. So we know that the relationship between alcohol and other drugs and incarceration is incredibly well established. We know the majority of people that go to prison have AOD use that is associated with their incarceration or their incarcerations. And the programs that are under investigation in this particular evaluation really emerged because CRC, again, in that sort of reflective service delivery way, had observed the way in which people leaving custody were so often excluded from services in the community, including AOD services. So the AOD specific and transition programs at CRC were really designed in response to a system that didn't appear to be able to meet the needs of the people that we were meeting in prison, particularly populations who had almost become used to being managed in justice system settings rather than really being supported in the community. So what CRC did is sort of design a program, these are the ones that we're looking at today, that rather than requiring people leaving prison to try and fit into models that were, say, appointment-based or residential or required abstinence or had very limited flexibility, had very little capacity to support people with a range of different support issues, things like disabilities, mental health, plus drug and alcohol. So around 10 years ago, in partnership, of course, with New South Wales Health and a number of other government health bodies at a federal level, we started providing AOD programs that, like the transitional programs that had come before it, really tried to meet people where they were at in terms of both substance use and also in terms of their support needs. So we know that there's a big body of research into the demographic and social and structural factors that define prisoner populations. And we also know that there's research that explores the capacity of various sort of psychological programs to reduce reoffending and recidivism, especially sort of in this sort of broad bit of literature around criminogenic needs. But what we really have noticed is that there's a gap in substantial research and evaluation around the efficacy of community-led post-prison programs. In particular, what happens to people, sort of what are the longer-term trajectory of program participants, and how effective are models of support for particular groups, especially those that are overrepresented in the justice system. So although we've got sort of limited formal research in this area, that's not to say there isn't existing evidence, extensive knowledge and comprehensive sort of small scale evaluations that has existed for many years about what underpins and contributes to successful outcomes for people leaving prison. And I guess that this work, this sort of the evidence base that does exist and what we're trying to build on in a sort of slightly more formal way with this piece of research, the previous work has been generated by on-the-ground practitioners, people with lived experience of incarceration, academics, of course, working at the intersection of research and service delivery. And there's many sort of community-based services, I guess, working with people leaving prison that do achieve remarkable reductions in recidivism and improvements in wellbeing using these sort of principles that have been established. But what we haven't had is something, I guess, of the scale of this that's been able to sort of look at a larger group. So what we did in 2018, we applied to New South Wales Health through the AOD Early Intervention Fund to investigate the impact of CRC programs and outcomes for a cohort of CRC clients. And these were clients that were based in the Greater Sydney metropolitan region. We've got offices in the Far West and other places as well, but we decided to focus just on the Greater Sydney metro region. And we looked at clients who were participating in programs around addressing their drug and alcohol use, as well as projects that were for clients who were transitioning from custody and were experiencing homelessness and required sort of support with their reintegration. So we were looking at the efficacy of long-term community-based outreach support for people leaving prison, the impact that these programs have on the client group and supporting their transition to the community. And this includes, of course, reducing the risk of reoffending, improving community reintegration, and improving social and health outcomes. And we were also interested in looking at the strengths and weaknesses in terms of the efficacy of the different treatment models and the cost effectiveness of the sort of economic value of this outreach model, particularly as compared to residential rehabilitation and also compared to imprisonment. So we'll go to the methodology slide now. So in terms of what we did, and I'm going to just be talking about the qualitative stuff, and Beck and Ruth will be talking about the rest of it, but we designed a methodology that had 5 discrete studies that all we sort of joined together in terms of our analysis. The first was a qualitative piece of research, which is 26 in-depth interviews with CRC clients and staff about their perspectives and experiences of CRC support. The second was looking at shifts in health and wellbeing by using the SURE survey, so the Substance Use Recovery Evaluator, over a period of time for CRC clients. The third was a quantitative analysis of CRC client outcomes. And this was looking at BOXAR data, that's the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research, which hold a whole range of data that we were able to access for our clients, looking at, over a period of time, over an 11-year period, people's contact with the justice system in terms of court appearances, in terms of custody and reoffending. We also used the matched administrative data set at the University of New South Wales in order to compare a cohort of CRC clients with a group of people held were comparable in the data set. So that we could look at the differences between people who had received CRC support with a comparison group of people who did not receive CRC support. And then we also did an economic analysis by looking at a matched comparative sort of case study, 2 case studies of CRC clients matched with 2 people from the UNSW data set to really try and do a detailed comparative analysis of pathways and the social and economic outcomes that were associated with CRC support. So it was an exciting and different sort of and quite comprehensive approach. We did, when we initially put in our funding, I think we asked for, I can't remember, millions of dollars to try and do it. We didn't end up getting millions of dollars, but we kind of retained the sort of frame of the research that we were really wanting to do, and did it basically in a budget way, thanks, enormously to UNSW, who sort of stepped in, and basically we exploited them terribly. Anyway, in terms of the key findings of the qualitative study, it was, and I guess that the value of the qualitative stuff in a piece of research like this is incredibly important, because if people don't go back to prison, or if people do sort of experience improvements in health and wellbeing, although other kinds of research can tell us that, they can't necessarily tell us why that is. And so the qualitative part of this research was super important in terms of actually hearing from clients about what the value of the CRC program was, and hearing from staff as well about how they approached it. There were really 3 key areas that we sort of identified thematically in these interviews with 26 clients and staff. The first was around the disadvantage, which was not surprising, but really, I guess, the fact that the clients of CRC experience both imprisonment itself and this sort of lifetime of disadvantage is absolutely sort of fundamental in terms of what's important to acknowledge with service delivery. Related to that is the meeting of basic needs, welfare, housing, health and support, absolutely fundamental in terms of both sort of changing relationships to substance use and also building a life outside of the prison system. But perhaps most dramatically, what we found was the way in which support was provided, the quality of support and the relationship between the caseworker and the client was fundamental in terms of achieving change in the way that clients sort of portrayed or experienced the support that was on offer. And that was in a range of different areas, including in substance use. I'm going to talk for a little bit, but you can read as we're going through some of the sort of quotes from people that we interviewed around how they experienced support. But the clients described the support as flexible, outreach, person-centered, proactive, relational. I mean, these are the sort of the way in which they described the nature of the support was absolutely critical, and the non-exclusionary sort of nature of it was seen as being absolutely life-changing, and also really quite unique in terms of what people had experienced. The interviews provided, not a surprising, but a very relentless description of the extreme disadvantage that's experienced by people in the justice system. And again, that clear relationship between substance use, disadvantage, and imprisonment was this really strong theme. And I guess that one of the things that, we really saw in these interviews is that, well, we know that there's not very much debate about the social drivers of incarceration or the demographics in terms of the disadvantage of those who are incarcerated. There is a real need to outline how it is we actually respond to this disadvantage when it comes to service delivery. So how services work with individuals who have experienced extreme structural and extreme systemic disadvantage isn't often really centered in the way we think about designing programs and services. And I guess there's an understandable tendency to really focus on facilitating individual change. But I guess what this research really suggested to us is that understanding the stories of the people that attend services in terms of not just their individual experiences, but of the structures that have just so often predictably really funneled them into the justice system is really critical. So participants talked about their experiences of homelessness, of poverty, of disability, of poor health, of mental illness, of racism, of racist institutions as trauma, and the relationship all of this has with both imprisonment and substance use. Most of the people that we spoke to had spent a lot of their lives in prison. They'd spent a lot of their lives visiting family members in prison, and they'd grown up in environments where prison was really normalised. Even though that was the case, it was still absolutely experienced as a kind of compounding trauma to everything that had come before. So the backdrop of disadvantage was really threaded through these interviews and understood by both clients and as staff as really critical to understanding the nature of the support provided by CRC and also in understanding why it seemed to work. So participants very clearly identified the very practical aspects of support that were provided by CRC as being fundamental to post-release success and also really crucial in terms of meaningful AOD support. So a lot of those supports that really are a response to this structural disadvantage in order to build lives in the community. Participants talked about their absolute need for access to basic services and opportunities, housing, health, legal supports, assist with finances, day-to-day support with navigating travel and appointments, connecting with communities. But more than this, what the participants really noted was the enormous value of having a worker that was going to facilitate this. And the qualities of the worker were absolutely, again, as I said earlier, fundamental in terms of the participants' experience of change. So that is having somebody in their corner who was genuinely respectful, engaged, non-judgmental, and really caring was considered absolutely crucial. So participants, had these really long histories and experience of services with both government and non-government organisations where they'd been treated in incredibly disrespectful and discriminatory ways. And often attempts to access services had been really thwarted because of discrimination, either because of criminal records or because of histories of violence or, because of the way that people presented. And participants who were clients noted just how much they felt seen and cared for by their workers, and participants who were staff without failure sort of noted how much respect they had for the resilience and the strength and the sort of, I guess, the strengths of the people that they worked with. So the nature of the relationship, the approach to the service itself in terms of providing outreach and flexibility was described as absolutely essential to post-release success. And so too was the way that staff were really able to kind of maintain engagement in a very proactive way, even, and in fact, especially when things were not going well for clients, even when they'd relapsed, even when they'd gone back to prison. So that metaphorical and literal experience of clients really being met where they were at was viewed as just critical in terms of building this life after prison or building a different relationship to substance use. And the fact also that CRC has workers that also have experience of incarceration and have experience of substance use was viewed by many participants as really important, not essential, but certainly as a kind of fast track to engagement. Having workers that had also been to prison really, I guess, assisted in that sense of not being judged and really feeling understood. I'm going to leave it there because I want to make sure that we have time to get through the rest of our presentation. So I'm going to hand over now to Beck, but hopefully we will have some time at the end for questions sort of around all of these different methodologies. Thanks so much for screen sharing, Beck.
No worries. Thanks, Mindy. So I'm going to talk to you now about the quantitative analysis, which is, I guess, far less intense in terms of getting the context of what's going on, which is where the qualitative study is just so important. But what the quantitative analysis does is gives us some measurable statistics to see exactly by how much does all of that good work that CRC are doing with their clients, by how much does that actually impact outcomes in terms of contacts with the justice system. So there's two components to this, the piece that I'm going to present to you, and then Ruth will show you some case studies. So the first piece is an interrupted time series analysis, which means that we look at people over time from the points, from years prior to their engagement with CRC, and then from the point that they begin their relationship with CRC in an AOD or a transition program. So this was for 487 clients who participated in Sydney-based transition and AOD programs between 2014 and 2017. And we look at changes over time before and after that in terms of contacts with the justice system, but also looking at differences for different types of CRC clients. So are there differences by gender, Indigenous status, or different program characteristics? And then the second part is where we use a comparison analysis, taking a subset of those 487 clients, who are 246 of those clients who were actually referred to CRC whilst they were in prison, because people can either be referred from prison or from the community. About 70% are referred from prison. And for those people, we compared them to similar people with alcohol and other drug issues who had also had a release from prison in the same period of time, but who didn't receive CRC support. And we look at changes between those differences and changes between those two groups. The reason for doing that is because whilst it's very clear when we look at the interrupted time series analysis that people's trajectories change dramatically after contact with CRC or after they begin their engagement with CRC, it is possible that there's some underlying natural tendency to change that might be occurring. And so we don't want to be overstating the impact of CRC. So by having a comparison group and see what's happening to other people who exit prison who also have AOD issues, then we can sort of deduct that difference that happens in general from the difference we see for CRC clients, and then we can be more confident of the size of the actual program effect. So that's why we've done this in those two different ways. And from the comparison analysis, we did a cost benefit showing the net cost savings from CRC and to the justice system in terms of the costs of reduced contacts with justice, and then compared that to the cost of providing CRC programs and found that there's a large financial benefit. So I will show you some of the detail of this now. I'm presenting everything graphically because it's easier to see what's going on than if I present the numbers. Some of the little waves in the lines, just the small movements, are things that would be controlled for in the actual numeric, the statistical analysis, but these are just predictions for different groups. So this first one is looking at CRC clients by gender and Indigenous status before and after what I've called the index date. So the index date is the day that people, if they were in custody when they were referred to CRC, then it's the day that they exit custody, because that's the day that the program can begin to have an impact on their connection with their contact with the justice system. If it's someone who was referred in the community, it's just the date of referral when that engagement began. So that's what the index date represents. And we see people here from, so we've got years here from -9 through to +6. That's the years, the negative numbers are the years prior to contact with CRC. Then we have the start of their engagement with an AOD or transition program, and then the years after that. The blue line represents Aboriginal men, the orange is Aboriginal women, the grey is non-Aboriginal men, and the yellow is non-Aboriginal women. And the 4 different graphs here, the first one is days in custody. The next one to the right of that is new custody episodes. Underneath the first one in the bottom left corner, we've got finalised court appearances per year. And to the right of that, predicted proven offences per year. So when someone goes to court, how many of their alleged offences are actually found guilty. And what you can see, no matter which graph we look at, is first of all, just overall and before contact with CRC, Aboriginal people have more contacts with the justice system than non-Aboriginal people, and men have more contacts with the justice system than women. Nevertheless, for all of those groups, after contacting CRC, after engaging with CRC, there's a dramatic initial decrease and continuing decreases over time in their contacts with the justice system, both in terms of custody, court appearances, and proven offences. Now, I'll show you another set of results. This is one where we looked at, so there's a few others in our report, but I've just picked out a few. This one's looking at different program types, so AOD programs versus transition programs. Mindy can possibly say a little bit more about this, but the clients in the AOD programs, like they have AOD issues, obviously. The transition program clients do as well. It's just not a specific AOD program. So everybody we're looking at here still has AOD issues. And what we see though is prior to connecting with CRC, the group who go on to join an AOD program have many more contacts with the justice system. So more days in custody than those who will go on to be in a transition program. More custody episodes per year, more court appearances, and an increasing number of proven offences over time, up until both groups commence with CRC, one on AOD programs and one group on transition programs. And whilst these groups of people are obviously very different in the beginning, after they commence with CRC, both have a dramatic drop in their contacts with the justice system and improvements over time, so that those previously upward trends are now decreasing. And there's a slightly greater reduction when we look at proven offences for those in the AOD group compared to the transition program group, and you can see that that gap is actually pretty much closed by the time we get to the end of that period. So the programs, whilst they're different and they're targeting different people, they're both incredibly effective. And in this next one, we're looking at referral type. So I mentioned that about 70% of clients are referred from custody and the others are referred in the community. Again, you can see, unsurprisingly, the people who go on to be referred to CRC from custody have more days in custody and more custody episodes and more court appearances. That kind of makes sense. If they're referred from custody, they will be more likely to be in custody. I should say, for any stats-minded people out there, I did control for the index date itself, so the period when the person at the end of that period connects with CRC, because I didn't want to bias the analysis by having an artificial spike there. So this peak you see here, we're already controlling for that period prior to contact with CRC, which is why you don't see the period 0 in here, because that's controlled for in the analysis. Anyway, for both groups, you can see that there are decreases in their contacts with the justice system, but much more so for those who were referred from custody, who are starting from a much higher number of contacts anyway, so they have, more capacity for a decrease. But the size of the decrease in numbers of days in custody and custody episodes and court appearances and proven offences, particularly for the group referred from custody, is dramatic, but also we can see significant improvements for those referred from the community as well. So this is the last slide of graphs that I'm going to show you, and this is from the comparison analysis with the subset of CRC clients who were referred from custody to CRC compared to people from our administrative data set at the university who had also been in prison and exited prison in the same period of time, who had AOD issues, but who didn't have CRC support. You can see from the beginning. So I've split this by men and women because there are actually less women in our comparison data set. So it doesn't make sense to show you the graph with those combined because men and women have very different numbers of contacts with the justice system. So the CRC clients, the men are represented by the orange lines and the women by the yellow lines. And the comparison group, the men are in blue and the women are in grey. You can see that whilst when we first observed them sort of 7 years prior to the prison exit, that's the index date, you can see that they were very similar, but that the group who go on to be referred to CRC are getting worse in terms of their contacts with the justice system over time. So that really indicates that CRC are targeting clients who have greater needs that they, than just the general prison population with AOD issues that might be represented by the comparison data. After contact with CRC, so after exiting prison and commencing with CRC, the CRC group's contacts with the justice system in all of the different graphs decrease. For the comparison group, after they have their first prison exit in the same time period, their contacts with the justice system do go down a little bit, but proportionally speaking, not nearly by as much as the CRC group. You can see if you look at the bottom two graphs, we do have limited data on the court appearances because our Boxar data at the university for court outcomes only goes to 2017. And because I was looking at it by the date of offence, I only used the data to the end of 2016. So it would be helpful, to down the track do another study with some more data so we can see a longer follow-up period. But the evidence clearly shows that CRC are targeting clients with great needs and making a large impact on their contacts with the justice system. So the last thing I'm going to show you is putting that into dollar terms. So what we did is allocated to every day in custody, every court appearance and every proven offence, we allocated a unit cost. So data from the report on government services, for example, tells us the cost per day per person in custody, the cost of different types of court appearances. And for proven offences, that's a combination of the costs of police and the costs to society of crime, which is, you'll see a reference in our report when it's released to where that comes from. So what we found was that people who received CRC support have a larger initial decrease in costs and decrease in the trend in their costs over time compared to the comparison group. So the comparison group also have a decrease in costs initially, but in that group, there was an increase in the trend over time after that decrease. Whereas for the CRC group, there was both a decrease and a continuing decrease year on year. The total net benefit, and I'll explain to you where that comes from, of CRC for a cohort of 275 clients, which is the number of new clients joining CRC programs in a year, amounts to somewhere between $10 million and $16 million over 3 years. And that's after taking out the cost of providing CRC. So I'll just break down the numbers here a little bit for you. So we've got 4 rows of data, including the totals here, which is the years after commencing with CRC. The cost savings per client is the first column. So that's the difference in the change in costs for CRC clients compared to the comparison group. So we're deducting any kind of natural decrease in costs that will be seen from the comparison data. And we see the cost savings per client goes up over time as you move down that column, because we have not only a downward shift in costs, but also a decreasing trend in costs. So the cost savings year on year get bigger and bigger. But I've only done the prediction for 3 years because we don't have data past there. So our models are based on 3 years post CRC contact, our cost models. We have different costs of providing CRC for female and male clients because female and male clients have participate in some different programs. And those programs have different budgets and different numbers of participants. So when we work out the cost per client, on average, male clients have a higher cost than female clients. The cost savings didn't differ by gender. By subtracting the cost per client and the cost savings from the cost per client, we get the net benefit. So the net benefit for female clients is $6,000 in the first year, and it increases up to $32,000 by 3 years after CRC. For males, we start a little bit slower, and again, that increases over time. The cost of CRC itself are only found in years 1 and 2 because most people, about 80% of clients are in the program for 1 year and about 20% for over a year. So that's how I split those costs up. So we can see each year for a cohort of 275 clients, the cost savings in net terms, so after subtracting the cost of CRC, go up year on year. So those 275 people saved the justice system $1.3 million in the first year, nearly $6 million in the second year, and nearly $9 million in the third year after they commenced with CRC, which comes to a total of about $16 million of cost savings over a 3-year period. Now, this analysis, as I mentioned, it was done on a subset of clients who referred to CRC, or it's based on a subset of clients who were referred to CRC from prison, but I've applied the cost savings to the whole cohort. So that may be ambitious. So if we take a really conservative approach in the other direction and say, all right, let's assume that these cost savings, so the cost savings per client from the model in the first column, if they only apply to the 70% of clients who were referred from custody, and we'll assume no cost savings at all to the group who were referred from the community, which is not the case, there would be some, but I just haven't been able to measure them, then we would still, if you multiply that number by 0.7 basically, and then redo the numbers, we still get $10 million worth of savings over 3 years. So in reality, the cost savings is probably somewhere between those two numbers, but we can confidently say that the total net benefit of CRC over 3 years for one cohort of clients is between $10 and $16 million. So I'm going to leave that there, and I'm happy to answer any questions at the end, and I'll hand over to Ruth.
Thanks, Beck. I'd like to begin by acknowledging I'm joining from Gadigal land, and to thank Mindy and Beck for their elements of the presentation. Before I go into detail about the case study section that I'm focusing on, I just wanted to give a little bit more context about the data bank and at the University of New South Wales that Beck's referring to, and the methodology of the work she's just presented in the case study I'm about to present, because I think it's important to think about its contribution to this evaluation, but also the reasons behind that data bank and the work behind it. So Professor Eileen Baldry, I guess, many years ago now, through hearing from organisations like CRC and many people themselves with lived experience of incarceration, and particularly First Nations communities and organisations, that actually the criminal justice system, while we're seeing crime going down overall across the country, actually prison populations have only increased. And increasingly what we've seen is prison being used as a means of kind of managing, it's an awful word, but police and courts and prisons, managing people with increasingly complex needs. And when we talk about complex needs, it's not about the individuals being complex, it's about failure of service systems to support them, education, health, other community-based services, and people kind of ending up in the criminal justice system because of systemic failures to provide support in the community, housing being a really critical one. And so the compilation of this data bank that we draw on is drawn from a cohort of people that were in custody at a particular period of time, 2,731 people, who Beck in particular knows in detail, a quarter of whom were Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, and all of whom at some point had at least one diagnosis, many multiple diagnoses of mental health issues and cognitive disability, and many of them, a large proportion, having drug and alcohol issues. What that data bank has done is included data collected by New South Wales government agencies from the earliest contact of that group of individuals with police as a person of interest or actually as a child at risk or a victim of crime. So all of their police contacts, court appearances, custodial episodes are in that data bank. But equally, whether they're a child in out-of-home care, their other kind of justice, health or hospital admissions related data. So it's linking that data to be able to create an understanding of the institutional pathways of people in the criminal justice system in New South Wales. And I think one of the really critical things to reflect on is just how dehumanising a lot of that data can be. And one of the things about using the data bank in this way to contribute to an evaluation around the questions that have really been led by those working in the community sector, supporting people with lived experience, many of whom themselves have lived experience, and shout out to all the CRC clients and staff who might be on this listening to this today, because their experience is very much influencing the methodology and the questions that we sought to answer with this evaluation. What the data bank assists us to do is use this to kind of say to government, this is your data, this is information you already have. And in answering the questions about what works around keeping people out of prison, there is a wealth of information already there. It's not from people's own perspectives, it's very much their institutional data, we acknowledge that. But complementing that with the qualitative work that Mindy talked about, I think is really important part of the picture in terms of contributing to the evidence base. So I guess also just reflection on the economic analysis, we're not saying that money matters more than people. And certainly our reflection around this evaluation is we understand that governments, policymakers make fiscal decisions about where to invest funds. We know how incredibly expensive prison is, and we also know it's really harmful. So if we're thinking about making the case for alternative approaches, it's not just about saying what this is cheaper, CRC or community-based support is cheaper, although it absolutely is on the whole, but where we have people who have had a lifetime of contact with the criminal justice system, we need to think about investing differently. This is a conversation we're having nationally at the moment around the horrific rates, ongoing rates of deaths in custody, but also thinking about actually investing differently in communities and community-based organisations. So this is something we can all talk about at length. What I will do is just jump to this, the case study here, which Amy, who is de-identified case study, who is an individual, a woman, a non-Aboriginal woman, supported by CRC. She is, we're not kind of talking about her particularly as a typical client, but certainly as one that will have resonances for many of you who have worked in this area. Her history, I suppose, is one of complex trauma and of homelessness, with multiple diagnoses of mental health disorders, chronic substance use and involvement with the criminal justice system. There are many services in the community sector who don't support people like Amy. CRC are one of the organisations that do. She has a extraordinarily devastating kind of history. She ran away from home at the age of 8, complex trauma as a young person, serious sexual assault, homelessness from the age of 13 as a teenager, spent time in King's Cross, where she found a community of people who accepted and supported her, but were also using drugs. And from quite a young age, was in a really difficult abusive relationship with an older man, had a baby at 17 who was removed from her care and placed in the care of the state. She had very little contact with her son. Her partner was incarcerated when she was 18. She was sleeping rough. And had almost ongoing regular contact in and out of the criminal justice system from the age of 18, very much connected to her drug use, mostly heroin. She, as I said, has a range of physical and mental health issues, and really became until she became a client of CRC's Women's Transition Program in 2015, had cycled in and out of the criminal justice system almost consistently. So just before her release, as CRC's model is, started working with a worker, developing a case plan, organising accommodation. Given time constraints, I won't go into detail about that, but there is extraordinarily moving examples of the impact reported by people of CRC's model of support on CRC's website, in annual reports, etc. But really, essentially, the kind of model of support that Mindy was talking about early on is what Amy benefited from. And it was unconditional, it was supportive, it was meeting Amy where she was at that time, but absolutely practical support around meeting her parole requirements, helping her attend medical appointments, access Centrelink, open a bank account, access ongoing primary health care. So it wasn't always health crisis that was leading her to hospitalisations or being dealt with in custody. And through her work through the Women's Transition Program, she also moved on to receiving CRC AOD support, which she continues to receive. And there's extraordinary detail in that case study around the difference that made. But essentially what we did, and when I say we, I mean Beck and our data manager, is found a very similar case study in our data bank to Amy, and there are sadly too many. One of the people that we initially matched Amy to had actually died, so she had similar demographic backgrounds and contact with the justice system, but the data showed had died at a certain point. The other woman that we matched Amy with had a similar background and trajectory and diagnoses, and what we did then through that, through Amy's own data, so getting her the information from Boxar about her court appearances and her custodial episodes, matched that with the alternative match comparison in the data bank. And so the slide here, the graphs you can see are pretty tiny, but again, in our report, we've got a lot more detail about actually the unit costs and how we calculated those. But essentially, we looked in detail at the 3 years before Amy received support from CRC, ages 33 to 36. We looked at her institutional contacts with police, court, and also social costs of crime associated with the offences that she was incarcerated for, and her time in custody. And then we looked at her at the age of 37 to 40. And what we see in this graph at the top is the match comparison, is the woman who didn't receive CRC support. And we look there at the breakdown of kind of costs associated with that. And so you can see here, without going into too much detail, at a snapshot, just the extraordinary impact in terms of institutional contact and associated costs for Amy after her interaction and support and ongoing support from CRC. Again, as I said, this is a methodology that we've used in regards to research and evaluation elsewhere and honed, but essentially you can see the extraordinary impact of CRC's support in terms of reduced contact with the criminal justice system. Now, we haven't costed housing and other support in there, so it's just criminal justice costs, we should note. But really, if you are looking for effective intervention to support contact with the criminal justice system and provide cost savings, as well as making an extraordinary difference in someone's life in terms of their thriving in the community. You know, for Amy, she talks in extraordinarily moving terms about the impact for her of CRC support. She's determined to not go back to prison as she has too much to stay out for. Her substance use has stabilised. She's able to deal much more with crises. She's got a long-term tenancy, building a relationship with her son. It's an extraordinarily moving and compelling story of the social and economic benefits of CRC support. Conclusions. Mindy, shall I throw back to you just to wrap up briefly? I'm mindful that we are at 10:02, but I think...
Look, I think that what we might do is perhaps move to questions if we've got some time. I will just say that obviously that, you know, we were thrilled with the sort of what we found in this piece of research. We sort of, as practitioners, we'd been kind of noting in our databases whether or not people were going back to prison, but we had never utilised external data in this way, and it was incredibly encouraging to see both the Boxar outcomes and the match comparison outcomes, and of course have that economic analysis stuff that I guess a lot of us in the sector know or have a sense about, but haven't, you know, had the opportunity or the resources to do this kind of evaluation. So we're very grateful that we were able to do it. And I guess it really, as a community sector person, I think that we really, I think that there is an enormous amount of evidence and expertise that is held in the sector, that is held by people with lived experience. And I think finding ways to communicate this expertise and communicate the sort of the amazing work that is happening is just so important. And I guess that what we're really trying to do with this evaluation is to sort of build a bridge between what we know about successful service delivery and what we know of the sort of broader policy and research challenges about how to address substance use, how to address recidivism, how to address the cycle of disadvantage and incarceration. And I guess that what our thinking is with this research is that the community sector actually has an enormous role to play in terms of being part of that policy conversation. So I might just leave it there, and perhaps we can stop screen sharing and go back to the sort of the group. I did also just want to there were a few people to thank on that last slide, but I just wanted to especially acknowledge Lucy Phelan, who was the research officer for this project, who did a phenomenal job over 2 years really coordinating all of this. So it would not have been possible without her incredible work. And also, again, as Ruth said, for the participants and the staff at CRC, some of whom I know are online, where we couldn't have done this piece of work without your expertise and without your participation. So I think I'll leave it there. Thanks, Tanya.
So we do have a couple of questions that have come through. The first one is, should full benefits include benefits for other parts of the system? Example, increased employment, tax contribution, decreased reliance on benefit payments.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, we can only do what's possible with the data that we have access to. So yeah, we didn't go so far as to do this from a full system perspective, but you would expect the benefits to be greater than what we've measured. We're really just measuring it from a justice perspective. But yeah, absolutely, there would be huge benefits to society from in an economic sense, from people participating in employment and paying taxes, presumably also spending less time in hospital. We didn't have enough data to look at that. So yeah, but yes, you're quite right.
Another question is, what are the resources you're using to support people in CRC?
Well, we have caseworkers. I guess it's a pretty straightforward support model. We have, something like 17 different funding streams from a whole range of different government and a couple of non-government agencies, and most of them support CRC to run programs using a very comparable model to that described there, but basically support workers with fairly low case load, so caseworkers that support people in the community and work with people in prison. We've got, obviously, the same as most other organisations, some brokerage funds. We've got funds to some project funds to kind of beef up our programs. I should say that most of our funding, we operate many programs at a loss. So we prop up a number of these kinds of models. We retain, I guess, the integrity of what the model is that we're quite committed to, often by having to run at a loss. So, we're hoping that this research will assist in kind of, I guess, developing case for what's actually needed and the kinds of cost savings that we can make if it's resourced properly. Oh, but perhaps the question, we're a mid-sized NGO, so we turn over around $6 million a year. It might have just been as straightforward as that. I'm not sure. That's a fair question.
Thanks, Mindy. There's a question about where CRC is in Sydney.
So we've got a number of different offices. We've got a head office that's based in Canterbury. We've also got offices in Penrith. Our women's specific project, Miranda, is based with the Penrith Women's Health Service, but we've co-located with a number of different partners in different housing places. We also, and then we also have spaces outside of Sydney, but Canterbury's the main office. We, as perhaps was clear, we have very few clients coming to the office. Almost all of our work is outreach. So our workers spend an enormous amount of time in their cars driving around Sydney and driving to people's houses, McDonald's and various other places, parks, beaches, to do the work that we do, which is almost entirely outreach.
A specific question in relation to the case study of Amy. Did Amy also have pharmacotherapy such as Buvidal?
CRC certainly did support Amy with pharmacotherapy and guidance around using that to reduce AOD use. I can't comment more specifically than that, but yes, certainly. We didn't necessarily cost that as part of the, it was part of the kind of casework support, but we do have in the data bank, we have at other times costed people's participation or receiving the pharmaceutical drugs of addiction scheme. So being on that, we've got costs around that Beck had identified. But yes, she did receive support around pharmacotherapy from her CRC caseworkers.
Somebody has written impressive work and what fantastic results, and they're interested to know where they can find the report or other publications.
We're very excited, thank you, and very keen to make this very public as soon as we can. We're still, and I think Beck and Ruth can probably explain the details of this, but we're still waiting on permissions from a few of the data custodians that contribute to the UNSW data bank before we can release it sort of publicly. But we're certainly thinking through how we want to do that, and and how we want to share, I guess, not just the findings for CRC, but perhaps the the methodology itself, I think, is perhaps a useful tool for other community sector workers that are wanting to use external data to kind of assist with their analysis of outcomes. But yes, so not yet. We probably I think in a few weeks we will probably have the permissions that we need, and then we'll look at how we sort of get it out into the public.
I might ask a question if I may. So can you give us a few tips about what AOD treatment providers or even AOD policymakers can do to better support people leaving prison in relation to their AOD outcomes?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that this is something that so many AOD services have done enormous work on over the last few years, especially. And I know there are obviously many amazing organisations that are working really strategically and specifically with people with criminal justice system backgrounds. But I guess that and again, the impulse for sort of doing this work was around some of those barriers to accessing treatment that so many people leaving custody had experienced or do experience. And so things that are complicated for, especially for residential rehabs in terms of accepting people straight from custody, accepting people with various criminal records, thinking through thinking through sort of some of that just stigma and discrimination stuff that I know a lot of services have been looking at around why is it that we think of people that are coming from prison as being fundamentally different from other people that are requiring supports. I guess that from the perspective of CRC, where almost all of our work is one-on-one, almost all of our work is outreach, we can certainly observe a kind of fear in the sector that I think is probably not realised when you're actually working with this population. So I guess that, certainly encourage all people in the sector to kind of think through, as I've obviously done, and workers at CRC have done, our own sort of thoughts and feelings and discrimination that we might hold about people coming out of prison, but also really looking at policies and assessment tools and thinking about what would this feel like for somebody who has got this background of trauma, disadvantage, and of being let down repeatedly, not necessarily by AOD services, but by many government agencies, and it all just kind of blends into an experience of really difficulty believing that people are genuinely there to help. So I think that, I guess, thinking through and understanding what that background often looks like, and perhaps opening up doors and policies and minds to the possibility of working with people coming out of prison, and thinking about what the barriers to your particular service might be with regard to that group.
Thanks, Mindy. We do have one final question, but we're also running out of time. So if you can answer it in 1 minute, that would be great. Can you describe the referral pathways and eligibility for the CRC program?
Yep, I can do it really quickly. The AOD program and the transitional programs are slightly different. With the AOD program, the requirement is that there is AOD use that is considered to be related to a period of incarceration. And we have priority given to groups that experience the most disadvantage. So that includes Aboriginal people and women with children. And it's all voluntary, so everybody has to want to do the program. The transitional programs tend to be funded, or a lot of them are funded through homelessness services, and some of them have particular demographics, like the Miranda Project is just working with women who are also at risk of domestic violence. I will say that primarily all of our programs prioritise people who find it very difficult to connect with other services. So our assessment criteria tends to be focused on people that have the most complexity of need.
I presume there's a lot of information on the CRC website, so we'll direct people there. Yeah. Well, thank you everyone for participating in the webinar today, and particular thanks to our fabulous presenters.
Thank you so much, Tanya. Thanks all.
Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.